Es hora de despertar y ver la gran necesidad de la humanidad.
Fui a dejar a mis hijos a la guardería a las 8 de la mañana. Levanté a mis hijos como de costumbre, los cambié, los arreglé para la guardería.
Felipe Montes and his wife have 3 young sons in Allegheny County, North Carolina. In December 2010, Felipe was deported from his family's home.
Tenía una cita porque tuve multas por tráfico, por no licencia o por no aseguranza. Y me encontré con 2 oficiales de ICE, de inmigración. Ahí se me hizo la detención y me llevaron a otro estado, sin decirle nada a mi esposa, sin ver a mis hijos una vez más, cómo iban a recoger a mis hijos. Mi esposa se quedó completamente sola, embarazada.
With Felipe in Mexico, his wife couldn't support her family alone. The Allegheny County Child Welfare Department took the 3 boys. Their family is not alone. A recent report by the Applied Research Center found that there are over 5,000 children currently in foster care with little hope of reuniting with their detained or deported parents.
Y eso es algo que a mí me duele ahorita, que mis hijos están en custodia de Social Service.
Felipe's children have been in foster care for over a year. Now on February 21st, Allegheny County's Child Welfare Department plans to ask a judge to terminate Felipe's parental rights and put his children up for adoption with strangers.
En este mundo hay muchas injusticias y ahorita por lo menos quisiera que enviaran mis hijos a México. Aquí les ofrecería yo lo más que pudiera.
Me duele mucho por el tiempo que estuve sin mis hijos, sin sufrir y todo eso. Pues a los no quiero recordar nada de eso, la verdad.
One morning in August 2010, federal agents stormed the home of Clara and Josefina, 2 sisters raising their 3 small children together. The agents handcuffed Clara in front of the kids, then loaded them into separate vehicles.
Yo quería mi teléfono para llamar a alguien para que fuera por los niños y me dijeron que no podían darme mi teléfono tampoco.
When Josefina got home from work later that morning, she was arrested by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, at her door.
¿Le preguntó al agente de inmigración a dónde le iban a llevar a los niños?
Sí, yo les pregunté qué iban a hacer con ellos y me dijeron que los iban a llevar a donde llevan todos los niños.
Hey, does she have a coat and shoes? Does she have a coat and shoes, Kathy?
While in custody, the 2 moms found out that they'd been the victims of a botched drug bust. The federal agents found no drugs and CPS found no evidence of maltreatment. But because the sisters are undocumented immigrants, ICE kept them in detention for 4 months. For those 4 months, the mothers had no contact with their children, 2 of whom are U.S. citizens. Then, without notice, ICE dropped the 2 mothers at the U.S.-Mexico border. They had little idea where their children were, except that they had been put into foster care with strangers. Under the Obama administration, a record-breaking 400,000 people were deported last year. These families have seen firsthand how immigration enforcement can tear children from their parents. Because they're locked up, the foster care process moves forward without them. It effectively puts borders on parenthood itself. The Applied Research Center's groundbreaking new report, Shattered Families, is the first national study to explore how children whose parents are detained and deported are placed in foster care. Over the last year, ARC surveyed foster care agencies and child welfare lawyers in communities across the U.S. and interviewed hundreds of caseworkers, policymakers, judges, attorneys, and foreign consulates, as well as mothers and fathers who are held in detention centers and who've been deported. ARC estimates that well over 5,000 children currently in foster care are threatened with extended or permanent separation when their parents are detained or deported. If immigration and child welfare policy doesn't change, another 15,000 may follow in the next 5 years. As one child welfare attorney told us, once parents are deported, they're treated like they fall off the face of the earth. This is a growing problem because the federal government now requires most local law enforcement to check immigration status. A routine traffic stop can lead to unimaginable consequences. Mothers that ARC spoke to in detention told us about calling the police on an abusive partner, only to find themselves having their own status checked. Once detained, most parents were completely excluded from decisions about the well-being of their children. One parental rights advocate told us about a mother that couldn't be found for 7 months because ICE had transferred her from New York to Pennsylvania to Arizona without informing anyone. ARC also found that many CPS systems and child protective courts are biased against reuniting children with their own parents in another country or with an undocumented family member in the U.S., so the children stay in foster care. This goes against clear research that children are better off with their own families, and it also violates CPS's federal mandate to reunite families. And Clara and Josefina, after more than a year without seeing their 3 kids, their family was reunited in Mexico.
Entonces me digo que a mí me duele mucho hablar de esto, por eso yo no quería muy bien hablar de esto, porque me duele mucho y no quiero recordar nada de eso, yo lo que quiero es olvidarme de todo eso.
But everything isn't back to normal. Josefina's son was only 9 months when ICE kicked down the door. He's now almost 2 years old. He spent more of his life in foster care than with his own mother. In some ways, they are among the lucky ones. Over 5,000 children with detained or deported parents are currently in the foster care system. Many will never see their birth mother or father again. And unless something is done, thousands more will follow.
Our next speaker is Senator Nancy Schaefer. Nancy? Oh, there you are. Yes, Nancy is a longtime Eagle Forum member and leader. She has had an organization called Family Concerns, which was very effective all over the state of Georgia, and another one called Family Concerns Pregnancy Center. She has been in the Georgia State Senate for several terms and is a member of 6 Senate committees. Please welcome our good friend, Senator Nancy Schaefer.
Thank you, dear Phyllis, and thank you to all of you. I have served in the Georgia State Senate for 4 years. One of my greatest pleasures, other than my sonogram bill, was getting the resolution passed to stop the North American Union. However, for 4 years, I have been confronted with families struggling to remove their children from the clutches of Child Protective Services. I wrote a scathing report last year on the corruption in Child Protective Services, and an update and copies are out on the table. During the last session of the Georgia General Assembly, I introduced Senate Bill 415 relating to juvenile proceedings, and copies of that bill are attached to the report on the tables. The Bill 415 called for the time allotted for the Department of Human Resources to provide emergency care to a child without a court order to be reduced from 7 days to 72 hours. It required a court order to enter the residence of a parent or guardian to seize a child. It called for family court to be open to the public. Confidentiality and secrecy in family court protects the wrong people. It provided that immunity in the system shall not extend to the seizures of children that are found to be in violation, nor to the administration of medication to a child over the objection of the parent or custodian, and it provided the state from applying for obtaining, receiving, or accepting adoption incentive payments under the Federal Adoption and Safe Families Act of 1997. The Department of Child Protective Services has become a protected empire built on taking children and separating families. This is not to say that there are not those children who do need to be removed from wretched situations and need protection. However, my report is concerned with the children and parents caught up in legal kidnapping. Having worked with probably 300 cases statewide and hundreds across the country, and in nearly every state, I am convinced there is no accountability in Child Protective Services. I have come to several conclusions. 2 or 3 are, 1, that poor parents, not always, but oftentimes, are targeted to lose their children because they do not have the wherewithal to hire an attorney and fight the system. That caseworkers and social workers are very often guilty of fraud. They withhold and destroy evidence. They fabricate evidence, and they seek to terminate parental rights unnecessarily. That the separation of families and the snatching of children is growing as the business grows because state and local governments have grown accustomed to having these taxpayer dollars to balance their ever-growing budgets. That the bureaucracy is huge. Look at who is getting paid. State employees, attorneys, court investigators, guardian ad litems, court personnel and judges. There are psychologists, therapists, psychiatrists, counselors, foster parents, adoptive parents, and on and on. All are looking to the children in state custody to provide job security. That the Adoption and the Safe Families Act, set in motion first in 1974 by Walter Mondale and later in 1997 by President Bill Clinton, offered cash bonuses to the states for every child they adopted out of foster care. In order to receive the adoption incentive bonuses, local child protective services would need more children. They must have merchandise that sells, and they must have plenty so the buyer can choose. Some counties often offer $4,000 to $6,000 bonus for each child adopted out to strangers, and an additional $2,000 for a special needs child. Employees work to keep the federal dollars flowing. But that is only the beginning figure in the formula in which each bonus is multiplied by the percentage that the state has managed to exceed its baseline adoption number. Therefore, states and local communities work hard to reach their goals for increased numbers of adoptions for children in foster care. As you can see, this program is offered from the very top and is run by Health and Human Resources. This is why victims in Child Protective Services get no help from their legislators. It explains why my bill, Senate 415, suffered such defeat in the Judicial Committee, and why I was cut off at every juncture, and why I was defeated myself last month for my re-election by another Republican. That tax dollars are being used to keep this gigantic system afloat. Many grandparents have called me to get custody of their grandparents before being lost in the system. Grandparents who lose their grandchildren to strangers have lost their own flesh and blood. The children lose their family heritage, and grandparents, and parents too, lose the connection of their heirs. And that the National Center on Child Abuse and Neglect in 1998 reported that 6 times more children died in foster care than in the general public, and that once removed to official safety, these children are far more likely to suffer abuse, including sexual molestation, than in the general population. Think what that number is today, 10 years later. Here are a couple of the recommendations on my list. Call for an independent audit of all state child protective services and for a federal congressional hearing on child protective services. Abolish the federal and state financial incentives that have turned child protective services into a business that separates families for money. I have witnessed such injustice and harm brought to so many families that I am not sure if reform of the system is even possible. The system cannot be trusted. It does not serve the people. It obliterates families and children simply because it has the power to do so. What I have said to you in these few minutes is that we must confront the fraud in child protective services. Child Protective Services seizes children using the very system that is paid for by the taxpayer who actually believes it is used to protect abused and neglected children. The bureaucracy of workers benefit financially by a system that converts children into cash while destroying their families and their lives. No child who emerges from the system can ever be sound or whole. Many disappear and never are ever heard from again. God will not stand for what is happening to our children and our families. His heart beats for these children. He will lift up the downtrodden. What is happening in America regarding child protective services is a criminal political phenomenon, and it must be brought to an end. Please join me in working to help set our children and our families free. To whom much is given, much is required. As you pray for this nation, pray for the upcoming election, and for our national financial crisis, please pray for our children and for our families. We all must press on and win this race for America. Thank you very much.
Edge tonight, GBI investigators are at the Northeast Georgia home of former state senator Nancy Schaefer. She and her husband were found dead there earlier today. Fox 5's George Franco.
Stunning story out of Pennsylvania where the Supreme Court there has just thrown out thousands and thousands of juvenile convictions issued by a judge who's been caught up in a corruption scandal. His name is Judge Mark Ciavarella, and he is now admitted to accepting millions of dollars in kickbacks in exchange for sending kids to private detention centers. The court says that none of these young offenders basically got a fair hearing. Some of them weren't even allowed to have lawyers during their hearings. So what happens to them and what happens to these cases? Marcia Levick is here. She's Deputy Director and Chief Counsel at the Juvenile Law Center. She represents the juveniles in these cases. What's been the reaction, Marcia?
Well, the reaction across the board is really stunning. I think that both the families, the kids, and the community is overwhelmed by what is really an unprecedented result in an unprecedented case.
In terms of what happens then to these cases, I assume that we're talking about 6,500 cases, just so our viewers know, or thereabouts. I assume that a fair number of these kids were actually guilty in these cases. What happens to them? Do they get retried?
The vast majority of these kids, first of all, won't get retried. I wouldn't assume that so many of these kids were guilty. More than half of these kids appeared without lawyers. These were hearings that took place in about a minute and a half. The judge made summary, arbitrary decisions about these kids, and they were denied the most fundamental rights of due process. So these kids are really getting the opportunity to get their lives back on track and to erase what happened to them.
You're right. I guess we can't make any assumptions in this case because, as the court has said, there really was no fair system and no justice. I know that you're suing for damages. Who and what are you suing?
Well, we're suing the judges, and we're also suing the private provider who ran these facilities that gave the kickbacks to the judges. We are suing the developer of these facilities, the Luzerne County itself, for their conduct in this. So we are hoping to get compensation for these kids and families who, as I said, not only suffered violations of their due process rights, but many of these kids and families paid fines and restitution, really paid money back to the juvenile court as a result of being found delinquent. So we're hoping for a victory there as well.
Real quickly, I understand, though, that the judge and another one involved in this case, though, they've asked for immunity.
The judges have asked for immunity, and we think that this is, again, just an extraordinary situation where you have judges really acting outside the bounds of the Constitution, and we are hopeful that the federal court will not grant them immunity in these cases.
Marcia Levick, good of you to be here, Marcia. Thank you. And just so our viewers know, we did try contacting Judge Ciavarella through his attorney. We were told, though, because of the pending criminal ruling in this case, and he's also obviously got some civil legal issues as well, that they would not.
Why would a child as young as 3 ever be on mind-altering drugs?
Well, for the past 8 months, the troubleshooters have poured through reams of state documents and discovered thousands of foster kids appear to be on powerful psychotropic or mind-altering drugs. Many of these children are barely in kindergarten. Some are even toddlers.
We didn't even know he was in the hospital until he called us from the Laurel Ridge himself.
6 years old and confined to a psychiatric hospital for a temper tantrum, a little boy calls his grandmother for help.
I mean, he was like, maybe you could say he looked more like a zombie.
How could you tell by looking at him that he was on medication?
His attitude, his eyes, his way of speech, all that.
Magdalena says a nurse confirmed her fears. Her grandchild was on 2 different psychotropic or mind-altering drugs, plus Benadryl to help him sleep. Turns out Magdalena's grandchild isn't alone. A sampling of state records released by the Comptroller's Office shows 2 out of 3 foster kids in Texas appear to be on psychotropic meds. The Medicaid prescription records are from November of last year and show that many kids are taking 2 or more of these drugs.
I have a child that's 6 years old.
At the risk of losing her job, a Child Protective Services worker spoke to the troubleshooters about one child on 17 different medications. That's right, 17.
He was prescribed, I think he had like 3 to 4 psychotropic medications. In addition to the Depakote, in addition to Zoloft, in addition to Trazodone to help him sleep.
Some of these drugs, the FDA says, are not even safe for kids.
He did need medication, but I had concerns about how could this child require 17 different medications.
What's even more alarming, child advocates say, are the ages of the kids. The troubleshooters obtained a never-before-released study that tracks the ages of these foster kids on these drugs for a 1-month period of time. At least 300 of these children are under the age of 7, preschoolers, even toddlers. How big a problem are these psychotropic meds?
I think it's far larger than you or I or anybody else suspects.
Jack Downey runs the children's shelter in San Antonio. This longtime advocate for children says his heart aches when he talks about the cases.
We had a wonderful family of 5 boys. If they walked in here right now, you'd just love them to death.
The oldest was 10, the youngest 3.
We were directed by the state to take the boys to a psychiatrist. We did, and they all came back on 3 meds. And those boys no more needed meds than I did.
Every child?
Every child.
Why would a 3-year-old need to be on psychotropic meds?
I have no idea. He was just the jolliest little kid.
So who's prescribing these medications? You would think psychiatrists, right? State records show one of the biggest prescribers in San Antonio is a radiologist. Sure, it's legal, but what does a radiologist know about a child's mental health? The troubleshooters also found some of these doctors have documented drug problems of their own. Like Dr. Charles Sargent, a San Antonio psychiatrist. Dr. Sargent is on probation with the state medical board. State records show he's been busted for prescribing dangerous drugs to himself, his girlfriend, and her son. Another doctor who shows up as a frequent prescriber on state records is Dr. Benny Fernandez, the medical director at Laurel Ridge. Dr. Fernandez says his practice is primarily treating foster kids, and he says psychotropics are necessary for a lot of these kids.
I think the way we are moving now is try to use them as a last resort if you can.
When you see more than 60% in that 1-month period that was looked at on medications, do you think that medication's being used as a last resort with numbers like that?
Well, those numbers seem a little bit high.
Do you think we've got too many kids in the foster care system on medication?
Well, I wish those numbers would go down. And that's what I think we need to focus our energy and efforts in making sure that the medications, when they are used appropriately, and there's a careful diagnostic evaluation.
That's not what many of the former foster kids I spoke to say happened to them.
I was on 7 different medications at once.
Zoloft, Paxil, and Wellbutrin, and Depakote.
They put me on all kinds of meds.
And all say being on those medications made their lives more difficult.
Like a zombie.
I wasn't myself. I was more of an isolator. I stayed to myself.
And my mouth would be open and I would be drooling. And
while Texas is just beginning to deal with this controversy, we headed to a state that began tackling the issue several years ago. Child advocates here in Florida are working to get laws passed to protect foster kids from being over-medicated. But so far, their efforts have failed. They blame the doctors and pharmaceutical companies who've lobbied against them.
We don't deal with the problems these kids have. We give them a pill.
Dr. Tony Appel, a neuropsychologist or brain specialist, was one of the expert child advocates in Florida we went to for help. We showed her the records we uncovered here in Texas. Does it look like the kids are being treated for behavior control or being treated for mental illness?
I don't think they're treating mental illness. Not in these kids.
The psychiatrists and the people on the other side will say, well, these are sick kids. I mean, these are kids who've been sexually abused. They need medication.
Being sexually abused makes you a victim. It doesn't make you sick.
So what are we doing to these kids?
We're taking away their future. We're taking away their ability to relate to people. Trust, love, caring, the ability to put yourself in the other person's shoes and to see how they see you. We take all that away from these children.
What we've come across these last couple of days are these kids who seem to be heavily medicated. Is that common, uncommon?
We're talking about kids in the foster care system?
Yeah.
When I worked in the foster care system as a CASA, which is a court-appointed special advocate, in fact, I found that there were an alarming number of children that were being placed on psychotropic drugs. And because I was a pharmaceutical rep who had sold psychotropic drugs, I was familiar with the side effect profiles and the dangers of these products, and I was really concerned because a lot of the children were only 2, 3, 4, and 5 years old.
2 years old on?
We're talking on major antipsychotic drugs like Zyprexa, on ADHD stimulants like Adderall. Absolutely. I saw a number of children that were very small children that were placed on antipsychotic drugs. And in fact, it was often, and most often, it was off-label indications that they were being used for. In fact, antipsychotic drugs are supposed to be used for psychosis, for schizophrenia, and symptoms of that nature. And I was seeing children who had emotional disturbances that, manifested in behavioral disorders, as well as just, everyday sleep disorder or problems of a behavioral nature that they were being placed on these major antipsychotic drugs for.
So why would you prescribe those for a child?
To be honest with you, I think there's only rare circumstances that you would prescribe them for a child, primarily because children are 3 times as likely as adults to have adverse reactions to pharmacologicals. So if you're talking about a very small child who has developing kidneys and liver and brain and that sort of thing, they don't have the ability to either metabolize the drugs or to eliminate the drugs properly, and they very often become neurotoxic because they pass the blood-brain barrier.
Now, the argument made that these drugs are prescribed as part of their treatment, yes?
That's correct. But the problem with that is if you look at the long-term clinical data on these drugs, they have artificial behavioral improvements that diminish over time and completely are gone once you withdraw the drugs. So it's really only a short-term fixed situation for a behavioral issue, and many times, as I said, the drugs are contraindicated when they're given, because I've seen children that are actually manifesting symptoms from a previous stimulant drug or psychotropic drug that they've been put on, and their symptoms are actually an adverse reaction, and they're acting out, becoming aggressive and violent and psychotic, and then they're placed on antipsychotic drugs, which is in fact contraindicated. Because if a child is exhibiting those types of symptoms on the other drugs, then they're neurotoxic, and that means you withdraw the drugs. You don't add additional drugs. But that's done constantly.
So what's the motivation for the pharmaceutical industry to prescribe these medications that at best seem questionable, at least in the minds of many?
Well, obviously the motivation is money, and they're extremely profitable drugs.
Oh, come on. Is it that simple? We're talking about children and who are at risk. And
I'm sorry, but we had people that were given Vioxx and were given other drugs that the pharmaceutical industry clearly knew that there were contraindications in the way they were being used and that there were risks that weren't being disclosed. That is not an unusual phenomenon in this industry.
In Los Angeles County alone, so many kids go missing that it is almost impossible to keep up. Some run away, others are obviously too young to have run away. As you can see, there are 30 more pages containing information about more children who have disappeared or ran away from CPS care. There are reasons those children run from CPS care.
We got a call at about 7 o'clock in the morning. The caseworker that was assigned to us told us that we needed to get to the hospital right away. Our son had been admitted to the emergency room. He was lethargic and he was non-responsive. He was 3 years old.
While in foster care, he had been beat severely by the foster parents to the point that he was hospitalized for a long period of time.
My son was black and blue, front and back, head to toe. And all he could do was scream when anybody got anywhere near his genitals.
He had been severely beaten and bruised, especially around his mouth where they had tried to force feed him, and trauma to his head, and that he almost died.
This is an American nightmare, and these children will never wake up.
We've all got rights. We've all got rights. And if you think you're not somebody who can lose your kids to DHS, neither did I.
Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. Up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are.
As you might have guessed, the children whose pictures just appeared on the screen sadly died due to neglect or were brutally murdered at the hands of the very people Child Protective Services, or CPS, had chosen to care for those children.
When I went to Mexico after 3 years of not knowing, no closure, because they allowed my daughter to be buried in foreign soil, I went there to see if it was even my kid. But when he tried to get her coffin out, and he kept hitting her against the rocks, the bricks, I told him she'd taken enough abuse in life, and I went in after her, and I handed her out. I finally got a hold of my daughter again. I laid there with her for 5 minutes and asked her to forgive me for trusting the system to do right by her.
I'm Ted L. Gunderson, a 27-year veteran of the FBI who retired in March of 1979. At the time of my retirement, I was the senior special agent in charge of the FBI Los Angeles Division with more than 700 personnel under my command and a budget of $22.5 million. Adults who were with the children, as to female adult and two male adults who were with the children, who are these kids? And the woman says, Child Protective Services, mind your own business. And that man, by the way, has disappeared. I also had a tip from an airline employee, a flight attendant out of Los Angeles, that a plane load of children was flown to Paris, France. Paul Benassi, my informant inside the Nebraska case, who was part of the Child Network, told me that some of these kids are auctioned off. He's attended 6 such auctions. As few as 6 and as many as 36 children were auctioned off at these at these various auctions. The children sell for up to $50,000 each, sometimes more. The ages are 2 to 21. The kids stand on a stage in their underwear with a number across their, with the string around their neck and a number on a cord, on a piece of cardboard, and the people in the audience bid on them, just like bidding on an automobile. This is going on right under our nose. I've given this to the FBI and demanded investigation. I gave the latest complaint I filed is in writing as of November of this last year. I just keep pumping it over to them, keep giving it to them. And I have a U.S. Customs report that documents this.